is for the Pro Patria Institute project on these 30 years with a purpose to evaluate how the fall of communism and its legacy have marked the development of Europe until today. How it impacts people now, too, right? So looking back today, back 30 years, how do you assess the events of 1989 to 1991 in your country and in Europe?
Well, I have to say that for my generation, in my country, and for generations that are older or a bit younger, this was something that was seen as impossible. We had the revolution in '74 in Portugal. We had 1 year of communism. So the idea of Cold War was very present. And we couldn't imagine that the fall of the Berlin Wall and then all the events, including the Baltic states issue, that they could become independent again. This was something totally surprising. So I would say the impact was huge because it gave reason to all the people that made, I'd say, the correction to the revolution. So in '74, it was quite democratic and pro-Western. After 6 months, it became a communist regime. After 1 year, we were capable to say, no, we don't want communism. And then all the country was, I'd say, very clearly orientated to democracy, to Western countries, to the transatlantic relationship. And so this was the proof that we were right. And it was a total surprise. So I would say that was the impact at those times.
Okay, good. So it indirectly strengthened democracy in Portugal by discrediting that authoritarian system of communism, right?
Yes, I'd say so. And this gave also, I'd say, that was what we could say, the proof, the evidence that we were right when we make that choice that was so difficult to do at those times, because we are at risk being the Cuba of Europe, as Kissinger said. And I have to say that in Portugal, the Baltic issue, especially the Baltic issue, was very well known. Even the first government of Cavaco Silva, that was from EPP, and was prime minister 10 years, it went down because of a visit to the Baltic Soviet republics that would imply recognition. And he said, I will resign because I cannot accept that members of parliament are doing this. So these issues were quite present at the time. So I would say that was the impact.
Okay, and fast forward to 2004, the Big Bang. What's your analysis of how the European Union was enlarged with membership of these Eastern European nations that were freed from communism? What has become of these common values that inspired Europe at the beginning of the 1990s?
Well, I think this is this is a huge success and very important. Knowing very well the experience of Spain and Portugal, we were quite sure that to grant democracy, it was very important to integrate the states that were former communist regimes. This was crucial. Also for us, it was crucial. We are only a democracy today because we joined the European Union. This was quite clear. So this was something that we had already experienced. It's not by chance that Spain and Portugal are always very supportive of this, I'd say, enlargement. And especially this one, because we knew by experience that to create bold institutions after decades of dictatorship, to create very firm pillars of democracy, the integration in the European Union was very important.
But did you expect it to be so complicated? Everybody thought in
I
2004,
expected
Big
that.
Bang, where the communism's dead, no problem. But there's still
No,
now a problem with values, no?
No, yes, I thought it would be complicated by in two different dimensions. The first one is that, and I wrote that at those times, even in a book, we should have changed the decision-making process in European Union before these 10 countries, and then with Croatia 11, integration, because it would be very complicated, and it is very complicated today. Sometimes people are at home and they say Europe doesn't deliver because we have a very complicated process. So this is one dimension. The second dimension is that for me it was quite clear that especially due to the totalitarianism of communist regimes, that was a bit different from the Salazar and Franco regime that were authoritarian, not totalitarian, especially the justice, rule of law issues would be a problem in some countries because they had no tradition of that. The tradition was that there was no separation of powers, and the truth is that in what doesn't respect to politics, in these dictatorships in Greece, in Portugal, or in Spain, the judicial power was independent. Civil law, family law, commercial law, even criminal law. Only for politics there were special courts. And this was not the tradition of the communism, where the courts were not independent. Yeah. And this would create, and if you look today at the problems that we have, fight against corruption in some countries, the change of the laws in Poland and Hungary and so on, they are normally related with the judicial power. So for me, this was quite clear that we would have to work a lot on this. And unfortunately, I think the problem is not solved.
But exactly. So with all that in mind, looking back, and the fact that we did have to build these judicial branch from practically from the ground up, are you shocked at what's happening now, or did you expect this?
Well, I'm shocked because I think that European Union, especially the European Council, has and have the tools, the power, the influence to avoid this kind of developments. There is a lack of political will. You don't need Article 7, even if they also don't do anything, and they could do with Article 7. If they do, like, for instance, I remember Chirac and Schröder in 2000 with the Austrian government when Haider came with a coalition into power, they simply made a kind of political declaration with some political consequences. And this had an effect. It would have been very easy to prevent some developments if this political will would be clearly stated by the presidents and prime ministers that are sat in the European Council. And they don't do anything.
Okay, so all this in mind, and then we have to remember the bad old days. We have to remember pre-89. But so are we happier now? Have our personal wishes and desires been realized over the last 30, 32 years? Are we happier and more satisfied with our lives and freedoms?
Well, I have to say something that is a bit complex. That is, we are clearly much better, all European citizens, than we were in 1989. And much better. And especially in these countries, and I'm looking Southern Europe and then Eastern Europe, people live much better. The problem is that in democracy, you raise your expectations. And so the gap between what we have achieved and the expectations that we have is very, very big. So probably people don't feel so happy as they should because they wish it to be much better now. But they are indeed living in much better conditions and with freedom that their parents and their grandparents didn't have.
Okay, now it's how do we close these gaps? How do we improve lives for everyone? How do we address the concerns of the EU through solidarity? Do you rate solidarity? How do you rate solidarity and cooperation in today's Europe?
Well, I do think that there will be always a gap. This is the nature of democracy, a gap between our expectations and our achievements that will remain. We should especially reform the European Union in order to give to European institutions the capacity to deliver on the fields where they are competent. We can choose not all the fields, but 2, 3, 4. This is very important because sometimes, look at the pandemic, for instance. We have made a special fund. We have European debt for the first time. So it's really a very, very important, it is an enormous step forward. But it took 1 year. We are still, and people at home, as they are struggling, especially economically, the small business, the tourist business, the industries, etc. They say, okay, you are taking too much time. You are not, you have probably the right orientation, but the speed of implementation is quite slow. And here, again, I come to my first statement about 2004. The mechanism of decision is quite complex when you have 27 states. And we should simplify it, bringing it easier even to understand. And of course, we also should, that is something I think it's more political than really legal or constitutional. That is, we should demand our leaders, political leaders, not to blame the European Union when they are in the European Council and they are not capable of deciding. They blame the European Union for the bad things and they claim for them the good things that the European Union is doing. So this is also gives some frustration feeling to the people at home.
Now, it was very important or interesting how you put things in perspective 30 years on, how we need to realize the progress that we made in the last 3 decades. And remembrance is an important part of that. How to promote coherency and understanding of Europe's recent history. For example, how to mark August 23rd as the Day of Remembrance for all victims of totalitarian regimes in all of Europe. How much does that help us? How do we make it relevant, though, for Europeans today?
Well, I have to say that we have a good example. In this case, it is even the biggest member state, that is Germany. Germany was able to create awareness and conscience of the crimes that were committed by National Socialism and then by communism and by the war and by this gave also a feeling of responsibility to the next generations. Not only because we can really do or make big mistakes, not only that, but that we have to pay respect to all the victims and to all the people that fought at those times when it was difficult, these regimes. So what they have done in their education system, in the public space, in the way they address even their international policies, external policies, I think European Union, especially towards these 2 kind of regimes, in this case the communist regime, is a very important thing. We have a very good symbol in Berlin, the Neue Wache, where is this mother with the soldier that is, it's like a Pietà of the modern times, that started to be a remembrance of Prussian times, and then it became against Nazism, and then against communism. It's always this, the human errors, the human mistakes of the regimes, they are there. And so we could use this example all across the European Union.
And what about connecting the past with the present, as we have done outside of the parliament, reading the names of deportees from the Soviet regime during World War II, and connecting that with the fact that there are still autocrats in the world, and that we have to combat against that and ensure that there is no authoritarianism within the European Union.
No, what I have to say is that we have to be very, very, very conscious that democracy is the most fragile of all types of regimes. It is the most fragile. Once when I was member of Portuguese Parliament, I made the speech of the 25th of April, that is the date of the revolution, and the coronation revolution. And I said, we have to praise our founders of the regime, but also all the others that are working now for democracy. Because democracy is the regime that owes less to their founders, because it has to be rebuilt every day. So the risk of authoritarianism, the risk of dictatorship, the risk of totalitarian regimes is there, is always there. We should never forget that.
Let's talk about ideologies. How much have they changed? Has the understanding of conservatism, liberalism, and socialism changed? And if so, how? That could be a whole day-long conference.
Well, I would say that they have clearly changed. But they have already changed more than once since 89, 91. So it was quite clear that there was a kind of new liberalism in the decade of the 90s, and this was totally linked or closely linked with the fall of Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. The same to socialism. The third way of Blair that brought the social democratic family to a more, I'd say, pink and not red approach. So trying to combine some Thatcherism with social policies was also a consequence. So I would say that liberalism became a bit more savage in the bad way, and for us that are Christian Democrats, always with the social concern that comes from the Christian roots, this more wild liberalism should not be, I'd say, stimulated. The socialism came to a more moderate way, and this was good, but this has already changed. Today, what we have is a strong radicalization again. And so, for instance, socialists are now very linked to some extreme left. They don't see that there is a kind of symmetry between extreme right and extreme left. So we cannot tolerate extreme right. I'm totally in line with this thought. But we cannot also praise people that are still defending, I'd say, a modern communism, a digital communism. This is something that we have to see. So after 2010, 2011, the big crisis, we had again a shift in these ideologies. There's something that also emerged at the same time, probably not by chance, that was also the green and ecological ideology. In a certain way, it was there with the nuclear things of the Cold War, but it really, I'd say, grew in a very, very, very visible way in the last 15 years. So probably today what we have socialism that is again a bit more radical. We have liberalism that was probably a bit more corrective again to a more social liberalism. We have conservatism that is also very strong today, and not in the good way, not in the Christian way. The approach of Orban or Kaczynski is not Christian. Christianity is about tolerance and respect for everybody. And so the roots of our thought in EPP as Demo-Christians are not invoking the name of God or Christian religion in vain to have a political goal. So what I say is that things are moving. And so I'd say that in these 30 years, we had two waves. The first one, to moderate the ideologies, and especially the socialism. But after the crisis of 2010, 2011, I think that we have again a very tribal, very radical debate. The division is too high. This consensual democracy that we knew from the Scandinavian model or the Dutch model or the Belgian Benelux model, even the German model, is in crisis because the radicalization is too high again, and this is totally, I'd say, linked with the emergence of the risks of authoritarianism again. That's why this idea that we have to care democracy, to take care of democracy every day, in every moment, is very important, because we are living very, very challenging times in terms of ideological divide in the society.
I'm going to jump ahead to question 9 just to let just to show where we are on track here, and then we'll go back to a global aspect. But I want to stay on understanding totalitarianism. The people of East Berlin have formulated a clear opinion that condemns communist dictatorships. Out of this arises a culture that remembers the victims of communist totalitarianism. Since the people of the West Berlin mostly escaped direct contact with the brutal, inhumane nature of the Soviet Union, the assessment of recent European history in various nations is not the same and often differs. Is our understanding of the crimes of totalitarianism clear and coherent enough that we can, with equal conviction, say never again to communist terror and oppression?
Well, I think there is a double standard. We have to acknowledge that. And that was what I was saying, that is very much due to some move of the center-left that doesn't put in the same level of concern far right and far left. And so what I say is that today there is a tendency to forget the crimes of communism more than it would be expected, because this is this kind of, I'd say, reconciliation of the left in a radical mood or in a radical mode is preventing them from being very clear. You see that when you see, even in the European Parliament, if something happens in Hungary and Poland, and rightly so, everybody reacts. But if it happens in Slovakia or in Malta, there is some condescending. So they tend to be condescending. And this has also to be with this communist things. What we see also in some political landscapes is that fascist politicians, they never jump to the democratic regime. But some former communist politicians are still acting as if they have no responsibility for the regime of communism.
Okay, another aspect since the change, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, is there is the perception that there are still walls in people's heads. 3 decades ago, millions of young people in Eastern Europe were enthusiastic about tearing down those walls. The spread of democracy, the growth of wealth and security in all of Europe, that was happening. But have these separating walls been totally removed in today's Europe? Or can we still sense a kind of lingering mental Berlin Wall? And what kind of danger does that present?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think that is a temptation to try to portray the situation like the survival of this Iron Curtain. What happens, and this is an experience that if you are in an institution like the European Parliament and you have to live with all the different national, I'd say, diversities, it's obvious that if you come from a country that is a Slavian country by language, that probably is Orthodox by religion, or is Lutheran, or is Calvinist, or is Catholic, and then you come from a Latin Roman country, or you come from Greece that is very much alike Italy and Portugal and Spain, but then is Orthodox, and this is the natural differences. So I wouldn't exaggerate saying. I know what people say. As they are dissatisfied, they think, okay, this is still. So we are second-class Europeans. That is not the case. What happens is that we have really differences. If I'm Irish or Portuguese, I'm in the far west. It's something. We are looking at the Atlantic. It's another vision. And naturally, it's difficult then when you have to have relations with Eastern countries or with Germany or with Sweden because they have a different perception. So I think that we should not mix some difference that will be always there and some ways of acting that we'll never enjoy, because then it also depends. If you come from a very big and influential state, you see things in one way. If you come from a small peripheral state, you see in another way. So I wouldn't, I'd say, overestimate this feeling, because I think it's not the survival of the wall, is really the consequence of the meeting of cultures and civilizations that, being the same, are very diverse internally.
Okay, then what about reactionaries? Why does it seem that so many are now disappointed and skeptical about the European values and the future of Europe, and hoping to overcome crises by withdrawing into isolation or relying on strongman politics?
I think that is totally related, again, to the process of decision. So the decision-making process is very complex. And so people think European Union doesn't deliver. And so this gives to the populists, to this radicalization, either in left or in right, a good, I'd say, argument, a good narrative to use against the European Union.
Okay, let me move to the next one. EU-US relations. How do you assess the transatlantic cooperation? Does it stand to weaken or strengthen in the future?
I think that is indispensable. The Euro-Atlantic relation, the Euro-American relation, the transatlantic relationship is in the DNA of European Union. A European Union that doesn't give all the priority to the relationship with North America, I'd say even with American continent as such, will fail. So it's of our essence, it's our DNA. And so for me, we need more cooperation. I hope that we can have even a kind of common market in the future. That would be a very good sign to the world.
Okay, and last question about the global EU, the role of the EU in the world. What should be done more effectively to increase and implement the unquestionable economic potential of Europe and its potential to take a leadership role in world politics?
Well, I think I would like to increase and to improve this capacity of global acting of the European Union. But I have to be very realistic. The external dimension is very, very, very national. The interest of a country, of Baltic countries, is different from the interest of Germany. And the interest of Portugal or Ireland is different from the interest of Greece or Italy. And of course, we could have a more consistent and dynamic external policy, but I'm a bit skeptical that we can develop really a global role for European Union in the political dimension. What can we do? We can do in a lot of peace missions in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America. Or we can have also humanitarian aid. We can do a lot of trade. But then these very classical foreign affairs policies, I believe that at the end, some countries would be in a very difficult situation if we had really a common policy where they were defeated. Because of course they have very different perceptions. It's difficult to have a common foreign policy, especially in the more traditional dimensions.
What about, just last question, what about the collective leadership among the EU countries to show leadership in the world, for instance, for a climate accord or for a biodiversity accord or in trade?
This is the right approach. If we want to have more weight at the global level, we have to go to some very concrete fields that are crucial. One is climate change. The other will be the trade relations, fair trade relations, where we have common interests, we have the same approach, and we can really lead. And so I would choose 3-4 main areas to develop this capacity of intervention. And then probably, if we are capable of doing this, in the future we can have a very traditional common foreign policy. But before, you have to improve in some respects in order to create the, I'd say, cohesion, and also to show that when you are united, you can deliver.
Paulo Rangel, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where are we now? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.